Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
He's not fibbing, that bloke with the booming voice. On the programme today, we'll return to that story. It's a moral quandary, but also a behavioural one for me, of Alfie Evans and the curious crowds gathered outside Alder Hey Hospital in Liverpool. Apparently, I don't know, actually. What, are they casting themselves as better qualified than medics, or is there something subtler or possibly more sinister going on? Your thoughts on that on the way. I'm minded at the moment in the second hour to return to that call yesterday that has left so many of us reeling. Chris in Cambridge revealing the misery visited upon his family after his daughter was groomed and then exploited online in the most vile of ways, and have a look at what parents can do to prevent similar happening to their children. And we begin, as I think everybody really should be, certainly in my business. I tell you what, we're going to talk about Windrush and we're going to talk about the failure of anybody to take responsibility for it, and we may even play out that clip of Theresa May explaining her thoughts on ministerial responsibility that we had so much fun with last week. See what I did there? I alerted my team while live on air to get that clip ready, even though I hadn't mentioned it before we came on air, so that I could at some point in the next 10 minutes send a signal to my crack team of engineers and producers. It's Jones and Beth today. And then, almost without you noticing, something like this could happen.
Yes, I think government has lost control of its immigration and asylum policy, frankly. I think we see a degree of chaos in what is happening, and what is perfectly clear from what has taken place and been admitted by the government at the beginning of this week is that we have in this government ministers who simply don't know what is going on in their department. We have departments that deny the truth and have to have it dragged out of them. I find it extraordinary that a minister isn't willing just to step up to the plate and take the responsibility. Right. And it seems to me that you don't have to take a ministerial job, you don't have to take the car and the extra pay and so forth, but when you do, there is responsibility that has to be taken with it. And I'm actually sick and tired of government ministers who simply blame other people when something goes wrong and are not willing to take responsibility for what is happening under this government and their decisions.
I mean, the irony is beyond delicious, because she has described to a T precisely what has emerged in the course of the last week with regard to the Windrush children. I mean, to a T. If you wanted to script something now to describe what had happened, you would struggle to come to a more accurate depiction than the one Theresa May used when seeking to castigate a previous government for sins nowhere near as great as her own as Home Secretary. And one of the few benefits, it's a pretty scant silver lining, but it is a silver lining to the dark cloud of feeling politically homeless at the moment, as so many people do, is that you don't come to a story like this with either your fingers in your ears or your eyes shut. You can, if you are currently unpersuaded by either party leader, you can actually achieve a degree of objectivity that's often denied us. I mean, however open-minded you try to be, if you lean towards one party or the other, then it's very difficult not to view them through the distorting lens of your support. And the objectivity that Theresa May aspired to during those comments could not be more absent than it is today. I sat in church yesterday at the Stephen Lawrence Memorial Service, and I allowed my thoughts to wander to the Windrush scandal. Lenny Henry, during his brief eulogy, referred to it in a very gentle and incredibly powerful way, and it occurred to me that an awful lot of people in that congregation were of Doreen Lawrence's, of Baroness Lawrence's generation and background. It occurred to me that I come on the radio and talk about issues like Windrush. You are kind enough to talk to me, but it never quite kicks in the way that it would if I felt that I was under threat, my elders, the elders of my community, my mum, was under threat of incarceration and deportation, despite being utterly innocent of any crime. And it was helpful to me to look around that congregation and remember that actually these are the elders of my community. These are the elders of my country, because they have a different background from mine, and I'm afraid it is pertinent to this conversation, a different skin colour as well. It is easy to forget, and I castigated Theresa May for this last week, and I will continue to, because I think that Theresa May takes that sense of separation much, much further than me. Is that she could sit in that congregation, as indeed she did. She was sitting very near Lenny Henry when he gave thanks for being able to speak in an unhostile environment. There may have been a small smattering of applause at that point during his contributions. And then he joked about his daughter being very worried about him being deported, and so she was at home searching for his passport. And then a comment about the impossibility for many people of being able to find documentary proof of one's residence in this country covering the last 4 decades. Could you do that, he said, although I couldn't from where I was sitting be certain at whom he was looking when he said it. Sir Lenny Henry, of course, I should add. And it was interesting, because I know this sounds a bit kind of sanctimonious, but I do spend a lot of time, as I know most people who listen to this programme do, trying to imagine what it's like or how one can end up at a position different from one's own. So I found myself sitting there thinking, how does Theresa May feel today? You know, this is a British Caribbean issue that she has caused while being repeatedly warned. How can she not feel some sense of offence akin to what she would feel if it was her mum being threatened with incarceration? How can she not feel empathy, sympathy, equivalence with a family that has seen their mother locked up at the Yarlswood Immigration Centre or driven to Heathrow, despite being wholly innocent? And it has a colour element to it, clearly, but that is almost coincidental. It has a political element to it, certainly, because responsibility for this lies absolutely at the feet of her stewardship as Home Secretary. I'm tempted at the moment, and when we move on to your thoughts, we'll throw open the possibility that you think Amber Rudd is herself culpable. I don't. I thought it was despicable that she attempted to blame it on successive governments. This is, I guess there's so much lies now in the right-wing media that this is one of the things that they can do. Daniel Hannan writing in The Sun today about Switzerland being a model for the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland is, even by the standards of the unicornists, it is an exercise in dissembling and deceit, the like of which I never thought I'd see in a British newspaper, even one edited by Tony Gallagher, who, as we know, has a relationship with the truth that could only very politely be described as strained. So they will put this nonsense out there that the UK Border Agency's decision in 2009 somehow leaves to destroy landing cards, somehow leaves responsibility for the Windrush scandal at the feet of the Labour government, and I don't know anymore whether people who repeat that line know that they're lying or whether they just don't know that they've been duped. Landing cards bear no relevance to this story. They were only relevant if Theresa May had done both. Their relevance is moot because they already had been destroyed when she brought in a policy that could have been ameliorated and alleviated by their existence. So she knew they didn't exist, and she did the policy anyway. Her situation would have been even worse if she'd done it herself. But it's still pretty awful. And if you began for a minute to think of your own mum, whatever age you are, whatever colour you are, you are a British citizen, a British resident. This is your home, and your mum thinks it's her home. And she is driven to Heathrow Airport and threatened with deportation. Stories are popping up all over the place now. Grandfathers who've been in Jamaica for 4 or 5 years and been unable to come back to the only country they've ever called home. This is where being a little bit politically homeless is helpful, because I can't quite understand, even with my incredibly hackneyed and cynical view of most of the print media in this country, and they still set the agenda for most of the rest of the media. I don't understand, or rather I worry, why this story hasn't achieved a status that would demand ministerial blood on the metaphorical carpet. The nicest interpretation I can offer up, the most charitable interpretation I can offer up, is that everybody recognises that if there were to be a resignation, it would have to be Theresa May's. You can have the liars in the Sun and the Mail pretending that it's somehow Amber Rudd's fault, which is more about Brexit than it is about Windrush. Or you could go further and try to punt that ludicrous line about it somehow being successive governments, as Amber Rudd did yesterday. These are not alternative views. These are lies that have been told to the British people by the most senior politicians in the country. So the most charitable analysis I have of those politicians is this. They know it's a resignation issue, but they also know that the resignation would be the last Home Secretary's, not the current one. She's no longer the Home Secretary, she's the Prime Minister, and the trigger for a prime ministerial resignation is so much bigger and so much heavier than it would be for a ministerial resignation that they are just crossing their fingers, I suppose, or they're applying a different criteria, which I think is just about excusable as pragmatic. But here is the thing that I struggle to understand why every person in the country isn't screaming blue murder about. 0345 6060 973 is the number, because that's the question I want you to answer from whatever angle you want. How can we sit idly by while our Home Secretary lies through her teeth about the fate and the freedom of utterly innocent citizens? Every week for 6 months, the Guardian journalist Amelia Gentleman has been contacting the Home Office and explaining to them what was happening. Every single week for 24 or so weeks, she's been phoning up the Home Office and she has been explaining what was happening. Yesterday in the House of Commons, Amber Rudd sought to claim surprise as her reaction. Surprise not only at what had been reported in The Guardian for 6 months, but also at what her department had been doing to British people. So either you have a Home Secretary who is so far removed from the reality of her own department that she doesn't know about innocent people being locked up, threatened with deportation and driven to Heathrow Airport and put on planes, or she was lying and pretending to be surprised. And when you bring the journalism into it, and truly this is journalism that makes the rest of us feel ridiculous, they must, and I have no other conclusion than this. Theresa May's government must have been looking at the Guardian's reports of Theresa May's immigration policy, bringing untold and wholly undeserved misery to as yet uncounted families. They must have been looking at it. They must have been recognising it. They must have been registering it. And they must have been hoping two things. Number one, they must have been hoping that it would just die down and go away. Or number two, and this is the frightening one, and at the moment, I'm afraid it fits, they must have been banking on the British public not caring about these older men and women in the way that they would about a different kind of older man and woman. They must have been banking on the British public not getting behind the Windrush children because they're not the same as them. She appears to have misjudged the mood, but only for now. Have you got a better explanation for how a Home Office can be contacted weekly with painstaking detail of what was happening to these men and women, these British men and women. And then 6 months later, only when the scandal has assumed a momentum that probably even the journalists who've undertaken these reports weren't expecting, only when the scandal has assumed a momentum that demanded public attention did they even acknowledge what they've known about for years in general and have been told about for months in detail. That, to me, I have a slight tendency to hyperbole. I appreciate that. And I catch myself sometimes, and I say to myself, no, don't go too far. I think this is the greatest political scandal of my life. And the reason I think that is simple. I just imagine that it was my mum. I just imagine that it was my mum who was told that she had no right to be here. I imagine it was my mum who was receiving letters telling her that she could be removed from the country. I imagine it was my mum that was drummed out of her job on the makeup counter at Owen Owens in Kidderminster because she couldn't provide the documentation to prove that she had the right to be here. She just had the knowledge that she'd been here for 50 years. My mum was born in Sheffield, not in Jamaica. But I don't see the difference. Do you? And I just wonder what's happened to responsibility. And I wonder whether you share my view. And we have in recent... We're going to come a cropper soon, I've got to tell you. This way that I cast myself as somehow swimming against the tide of the rest of the media. It's not only quite arrogant, but it's also probably hubristic. So I sit here and see something. It's all the fault of Brexit. Now that I'm getting all my confidence derived from seeing evidence that I was right. You say, well, look, I told you that couldn't happen, and I told you that couldn't happen, and then all these people queued up to say, no, it could, yes, it could, and now it's all falling apart. I'm backing myself even more than I used to. And that's a recipe for disaster. But today's not the day that I come a cropper, because I can't understand why the Windrush story isn't bringing down Theresa May's government. 0345 6060 973, unless locking up innocent old black people doesn't offend the United Kingdom in the way that locking up innocent old white people would. I don't want to be left with that conclusion, so give me a better one. Richard's in Llanelli. Richard, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Yeah, I sent you last week a rambling email, and I'll try and praise-see it in...
If you would.
I'll do my best, James. Now, don't shoot me down when I say I was a Conservative Party member until about 4 or 5 years ago.
I wouldn't even dream of shooting you down for doing that. Some of my closest friends are Conservative. I've got friends who are Conservative MPs, mate. No,
and rather than the opposite way of George Orwell, most of my best friends are old-school socialists.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you for your campaigning, James, and carrying on about pushing the Windrush generation story. I think there's just a real arrogance, and that's what caused me to leave the Conservative Party, an arrogance and an out-of-touchness and a holier-than-thou superior attitude, as you were talking about last week, of the people in the street. We're just the great unwashed. We're not clever enough to understand.
Because under the race element of the Windrush story, I think there's a class element as well, isn't there?
Definitely there is a class element, and there's a nasty race element, and it's just... do you know, James, I'm not one to ever stop blabbing, but this really leaves me speechless, and it upsets me. And my better half, she's an old-school Labour supporter, and her and I have been talking about the Windrush generation for many years, and to see this come to light, and these poor people who live in fear of have they got a home to, literally and metaphorically home.
Yes.
It's really frightening, James, and thank goodness you're still pushing.
Yes, but I'm just... I'm very grateful for your kind words. But the key journalism has been done by one of the least read newspapers in the country. I, for one, am going to start reading The Guardian a lot more closely than I have done over the years. In fact, I've said to before on the programme, I rarely read it up until relatively recently.
Okay.
And then there's little old us here. We've got 1 million listeners a week, but in the great context of the British media, you know you're causing problems when the Sun dedicates a whole op-ed to how awful you are as an individual. So obviously we're popping some balloons, we're pricking some consciences, but I think unless the BBC and the Daily Mail and... the Times have been pretty good on this, but the Conservative leadership, the Downing Street seems to dance almost entirely to the Daily Mail's tune. And although they've expressed some dissatisfaction about the Windrush scandal, they have not, and they've used it as a stick with which to beat Amber Rudd, until that engine of hatred is focused upon Theresa May, I think they just get away with it. It doesn't matter how angry you get, how angry I get. It doesn't matter how viral our clips go. It doesn't matter how many people ring up to tell us that they are in this boat, how many people ring up to tell us that their dad is stuck in Jamaica or their grandma is frightened of being deported. It just doesn't seem, in modern Britain, post-Brexit, 21st century Britain, it's almost like the cog isn't biting the gears. Do you know what I mean? They're just spinning around and they're not biting the gears. Nothing happens.
The clutch.
That's it. That's what I meant.
But the thing is, James, you've got to wonder as well how many people in the cabinet have a sort of were taught history at school. And understand, when I was at school in Slough, we were taught history, and we were taught it up to probably, this was in the 70s, I was at school there, up to probably the immediate post-war period.
Yeah.
So we understood it. Now, is it a lack of being taught history, or is it just an arrogance? And I fear, James, it's an arrogance, and it's an out-of-touchness. I really do.
Well, you're possibly more charitable than I am, and I think the class element...
I'm tempering it, James.
Are you?
Off air, yes, you and I would have a very good conversation.
A very colourful, a very Anglo-Saxon exchange. And you speak as a formerly fully paid-up member of the Conservative Party, which is pertinent to what I said about objectivity being helpful here. I cannot, for the life of me, understand why Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitism conference, which I think is important and necessary, not everybody does, I happen to, I cannot for the life of me understand how it's even on the same page as the Windrush scandal at the moment. It seems to me to speak to some of the people who constantly insist upon bias where there is none. It doesn't mean there isn't ever any, but this story is about old British people having lived here for decades, being frog-marched out of their own front doors and driven to Heathrow Airport under threat of immediate removal. Now, I do not understand and will never understand how anybody could be comfortable with that unless it is a comfort derived from the knowledge that it could never happen to me because, well, fill in the gaps yourself. Ideally, though, give me a more charitable analysis. This is, you know what I do. I say stuff on air and then sometimes regret it immediately afterwards. But I can't think of a bigger scandal. Because this is about people. This is about people who've been here for decades and who have been criminalised and punished for nothing. And Amber Rudd pretended to be surprised in the House of Commons yesterday. I don't think she should go. I think that the person responsible for the policy should go. But the person responsible for the policy is the Prime Minister. This is a mess. And I hesitate to say this, but so much of political coverage now is so skewed. Brexit's broken objectivity. It's broken proper journalism because so many previously proper journalists have, whether wittingly or unwittingly, ended up spreading propaganda for liars and deceivers. So I don't know that anything's going to happen. I think we may now inhabit a country where our elderly neighbours can be rounded up and locked up and no politician carries the cat. Just think about that line. There you go. We got it. We always get there in the end. Thanks to Richard for helping me, for holding my hand all the way from Wales. We have created a country where innocent old people can be rounded up, persecuted, locked up and deported while being wholly innocent as a direct consequence of government policy, and no politician will be punished. If you want to ring me up and justify that, I'll stay silent because I would love to hear how you do that. I'll say it again. Elderly British people rounded up, persecuted, incarcerated, deported, while wholly innocent of any crime. It happens as a direct result of a policy framed by Theresa May, the current Prime Minister, presided over by Amber Rudd, the current Home Secretary. And no politician will be held responsible or accountable or be punished. I want you to ring me now and tell me why. Because if it was my mum or your mum, I'm pretty sure that heads would have rolled. Why aren't heads rolling? That's it, and it's taken me a while to get there, but that's the question I need you to answer, okay? Elderly British citizens under the 1948 British Nationality Act, the Windrush generation were British citizens when they were invited here. So for Amber Rudd to say yesterday that they're going to be rendered eligible for it is actually adding insult to profound injury. Here's the question you need to answer. Elderly British citizens, wholly innocent of any crime, are being frog-marched out of their own front doors and driven to detention centres or airports under threat of deportation. And the two politicians who bear personal responsibility for the introduction and the enacting of the legislation that has made this possible currently occupy two of the most powerful positions in the land and do not seem set to surrender them. It is beyond doubt that they knew what was happening. We will speak in about 10 minutes' time to the journalist who told them weekly for 6 months. So why do you think modern Britain has become a place where the government can round up innocent people, innocent old people, and bear no consequences whatsoever? All the claptrap about democracy and transparency and nonsense during the referendum campaign, this is the definition of a democratic decline. When a government can persecute innocent citizens and nobody in government gets punished. I don't care who you support. I don't care what party you are drawn to. I don't care where you live, what colour you are, or how you define yourself. You do not want to live under a government that can lock up and persecute innocent citizens and, when the truth emerges, go unpunished. You just don't. But, of course, if you do, give me a call. Kel's in Islington. Kel, what's going on?
Man, boy, that was the most heaviest introduction I've ever heard you ever do. When you said it's the worst political scandal you have ever...
I think so. In terms of something enacted by politicians, there have been stories in my lifetime that have been more disgusting, that people have died, but in terms of something that has been done by politicians to people deliberately and consciously, I can't think of anything bigger.
I mean, I'm of Guyanese heritage, so if my parents obviously came over here, if it wasn't for them coming here and me being here right now, I wouldn't be able to speak.
Mate, the phone line's all over the place, Kel. I'm going to come back to you in a minute. I don't know how that happened. My apologies. Graham is in Norwich. Graham, what's going on?
Oh, yes, hello, James. Well, Windrush and anti-Semitism and knife crime, they're all minority issues, and I suspect that Theresa May is calculating that she can still win a general election in spite of all the furore.
I'm going to separate knife crime and anti-Semitism from Windrush, because knife crime and anti-Semitism are not done to the population by the government.
Yeah, fair enough.
So the question is, how can the government do this to British citizens and not get punished?
Well, two examples from the past. The first, Tony Blair won a general election after the Iraq War started, so he got away with that. But Margaret Thatcher didn't get away with the poll tax because the Tories realised that the public as a whole...
But again, this is about what a government has done to British citizens. The retrospective failure of Iraq, the poll tax, these are not remotely pertinent. Why do you think Theresa May thinks that she can persecute innocent British people and not be punished? What is her reasoning? When she crosses her fingers, what is she hoping for?
Well, as I now said, she's hoping that the public will see this as a minority issue, and people vote with their money. They don't vote on any particular issue. And because it's a minority issue, because it doesn't affect most people, she's calculating she can still win the next general election.
She's calculating that a significant majority of the British public will think, I don't really care about this because I'm not black.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a grim conclusion. 10:40 is the time. Let's give Kel another go, back in Islington. Kel, what is going on? Graham's conclusion from Norwich is bleak, but at the moment it's irresistible. She's looked at the landscape, she's hoped it would go away, and if it didn't go away, she's calculated that when push comes to shove, the voters won't care enough because all of the victims of this policy have been black and old and innocent.
I haven't got the answers for this at all. I don't think anybody has. The only thing is that we've got our children and teenagers. My teenagers are about the same age as yours, watching this, and not seeing anybody come forward and holding themselves responsible for this. So what example are we setting for our children? And nonetheless, their peers that are most probably, they're looking at and thinking, gosh, is that what's happening to your grandparents? Is that what we're doing? Or vice versa, look what you've done to us. I mean, can you imagine? Now,
I can imagine, but that's all I can do. The phone line's gone bad again, Kel. I know it was better when you were speaking to Beth, so we'll keep it relatively brief. What's the calculation in Downing Street at the moment when she gathers her senior aides, who, you know, the former political editor of the Daily Mail and the former editor of the Andrew Marr programme? They know how the media works. They've got better insights than I've got. So what's the calculation those three are making when they say, well, look, obviously, innocent old British people have been persecuted, incarcerated, threatened with deportation, probably actually deported. It's all your fault, but you're going to be okay if... Well, we shall leave those three musketeers having their conversations while Kel, because I don't know. So you've got the former political editor of the Daily Mail, a chap called James Slack, the guy who wrote the Enemies of the People article. You've got a former editor of the Andrew Marr programme, whose name temporarily escapes me. And then you've got the Prime Minister. And they're all sitting there, three of them, right? And here's the conversation that they're having. It's your fault, obviously. We know that. Hopefully we can persuade the punters that it isn't. We know it's your fault because you were warned that this was going to happen. You were warned that it was happening, and you were warned that it had happened. You elected to ignore that. You've tried to sort of pass the buck, and the editor of the Daily Mail will help you, to Amber Rudd, even though that's completely fraudulent. The editor of The Sun, Tony Gallagher, will probably join in. But what we need to... the only way you can get away with this, Prime Minister, is if... What? Because innocent British pensioners have been persecuted, incarcerated and deported. And no politician is responsible. Gilbert is in Wimbledon. Gilbert, what would you like to say?
Morning, Mr. Tory. Morning.
Hello, Gilbert.
It's the first time I'm calling you, but I'm about 40 years listening to LBC.
Good grief. So Steve Allen was just turned 65 when you started listening.
The fellow who did your show used to be an Australian fellow.
Brian Hayes, the legend,
That's it.
to whom we all aspire. Now, what's prompted you to break your duck and ring in today, Gilbert?
No, I did break my duck with Sheila last week.
Good, because this story has...
Oh, we are the products. We are the products. We're the ones on the shelf for sale. And that is how we see ourselves. We are just products for sale.
So when I say, how can this government have done this to people like me, you say, we have never been people like you in this country, James.
If you denied that slavery happened, if you will teach us that slavery happened, when you say it to anyone, we will remove these people that have no history. You destroyed our history from day one. I don't have an African name. I have an English name, which means I have no history. I couldn't go to Africa. No one would recognize me. I am a born, trained Englishman in another place.
But you must have felt some sense of belonging over your years in this country.
I can only belong to the place where I was born. There's a saying in the Caribbean, your navel string born here, buried here, which is what your umbilical cord. Wherever your umbilical cord is buried, that is where you feel the belonging. But I was a trained British person, so was my parents and my grandparents. We were beaten to be trained to be English.
So how do
but
you...
we had no history.
I understand that.
So when we come here and people says we could remove these individuals, We weren't expecting anyone to make a noise. Who are these people?
When did you realise this was happening, Gilbert? When did you realise that men of your generation, men and women of your generation, were being...
Look at it this way.
Go on.
I have a daughter. Well, 2 of my kids are born overseas.
Yeah.
I have a daughter. When my mum died, they refused her entry to come to the funeral. So we knew it was happening a long time ago.
Can you talk me through why you... With reference perhaps to more modern times, I understand and appreciate everything you've said about this.
Modern times is this way.
Yeah.
When we continue to regurgitate through our children hatred and supremacy that certain people do not matter, the child today is a supremacist in 15 years' time.
And this language makes us think of Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan, but you're describing something much, much subtler than that. You're describing a vicar's daughter from the home counties who looks at you and does not see somebody who is equivalent to her.
Can't do. She's been indoctrinated, never to.
See, I'm uncomfortable with that conclusion. I think it's possibly unkind.
That she's indoctrinated? She doesn't know she's indoctrinated.
That's a little more generous.
I give her that. As I said to a lot of my white friends when I was growing up, in my teens.
Yes.
I says, I understand your anger for me being here because the people in power never told you I was coming. I turned up in your house uninvited. I was taken and put into your house and asked you to sleep in your bed. How would you feel?
Why then, and you've answered this in part already, but I'll ask you explicitly, how do you explain a British Prime Minister, a British Home Secretary, presiding over the persecution, the incarceration, and the potential removal of innocent British citizens, and nobody gets punished? Nobody.
There is going to be nobody. It's in our DNA. Why should she feel any way about it? I don't see why people feel she got to feel so. It's in our DNA. And we know in the black society, it's in our DNA. We don't expect anything from it. In fact, what we're getting, I know we're crying out and bawling, but it's not a shock to us. Believe me, I will tell you, if you really ask them a question, if they ask them on the street, they will say, what can we expect of these people? They've never had respect for us. And that's the honest truth. If you don't have respect for certain individuals, you can do anything to them. You can go to bed and sleep on it. Drink a glass of champagne.
Because you think that they look at you and they think you are less than me.
Yes, because a lot of them are the descendants of the slave. We are still paying for slavery up to today. We are paying the British government for slavery up to today. We don't tell our children that. We don't tell the child in the Hackney estate that. But the people sitting in laws knows it. So they let a few of us in as a conscious thing. Right now, they're going to the Caribbean to recruit nurses to come here to treat them the same way they would treat the last set of nurses. Could you believe that?
I can. It was announced on Friday. These are sort of 3 years, come here, train, nurse, and then...
I would tell those nurses straight to after 5 years and make sure all you will get citizenship as your right. That should be the contract.
There's a great line by I think he's Swiss, a Swiss novelist in the 1960s, Max Fischer, who said, "We wanted workers and we got people."
I'm afraid that's what happened to the British government when they let us into the rich rush. They did not know that we were more English than the English.
We wanted workers and we got people. And I guess the only way you can account for the attitude of Theresa May to people like Gilbert is that in her mind, and he was very generous in saying that it's through no fault of her own, she didn't even know it was happening, he's somehow less of a person than she is. If you've got a different conclusion, you can explain how innocent British people can be persecuted, incarcerated, and frog-marched out of their own front doors as a consequence of a policy, and no politician gets punished. You tell me how you can possibly be cool with that. Because the only answer we've got is, yeah, it's only happening to black people, mate. Chill out. Possibly one of the most egregious things that I've ever heard uttered in Parliament. Let's remind ourselves what the current Home Secretary said yesterday about the misery and torture visited upon wholly innocent British pensioners as a direct consequence of the previous Home Secretary's policy. That phrase, hostile environment, tells you everything you need to know about what Theresa May thinks of men like Gilbert.
All members of this House will have seen the recent heartbreaking stories of individuals who have been in this country, sometimes for decades, struggling to navigate an immigration system in a way they never, ever should have been. These people worked here for decades. In many cases, they helped establish the National Health Service. They paid their taxes, enriched our culture. They are British in all but legal status, and this should never have been allowed to happen. Both the Prime Minister and I have apologised to those affected, and I am personally committed to resolving this situation with urgency and purpose.
Surprise, apology, personal commitment to solve it with urgency and purpose. Amelia Gentleman is the Guardian journalist who has spent the last 6 months painstakingly detailing the plight of people affected by that hostile environment, and she joins me now. Can you conceive of any circumstances in which either the current or the last Home Secretary could have been surprised by the, what would I say, by the digesting of stories you've been writing for the last 6 months?
Well, it's so interesting what's happened in the past 10 days, because 10 days ago, if you remember, the Downing Street didn't think that this matter was serious enough, that it needed to schedule time to meet the Caribbean leaders at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and they rejected a formal request from them for a meeting. There was no sense, even 10 days ago, that this was a matter that either the Home Office or the government was taking seriously at all. And that was a matter of some surprise, I suppose, because we've been detailing case after case of people in this situation since, I think, the beginning of November or the last couple of days of October last year. And each time I had to go to the Home Office to get a statement after describing what the issue was. And at no point did anybody in the Home Office say, we think that this is heartbreaking, or we're worried about these stories that you're raising with us. Each time I got a formal quote to use in the article that said something along the lines of, we value people from the Commonwealth, and anyone in this situation needs to seek legal advice.
So week in, week out, you were bringing these cases to their attention. You were providing them with names and numbers and full details of what they were experiencing. And the head of the department that you were contacting week in, week out stood up in the House of Commons yesterday and suddenly described an urgent need to fix these problems. You must wonder whether you've woken up in a Franz Kafka short story.
It's just really, really odd, because I can understand that The Guardian isn't perhaps the newspaper of choice either for the Prime Minister or for the Home Secretary.
No, but they'll know what's in it, Amelia. They'll know what's in it.
What about their staff? What about the people who were briefing them, giving them press briefings? What I don't understand is why they didn't think that some of these stories were important enough that they needed to brief them about it. And certainly Theresa May didn't even seem to know about the case of Albert Thompson, the Londoner, who was being asked to pay £54,000 for his cancer treatment, and he still is being asked, still doesn't quite know what's happening to him.
Next. So she's already spoken in the House of Commons in a way designed to take the sting out of that particular story, but as you told us last time we spoke, he hasn't received any positive information, or he certainly hasn't received the treatment that she gave the impression he was poised to receive.
Yeah, he still doesn't know exactly what's happening.
You are a news journalist in the strictest sense of the word, so I'll understand if you don't answer this question, but how do you account for it personally? You know that in number 10 Downing Street now, you have the former Daily Mail political editor, James Slack, you have the former editor of the Daily and Sunday Politics, Robbie Gibb. They will be advising on news management, and they must have been hoping to manage the news you've been writing in a way that hasn't happened.
I don't feel that they've managed it that well. I mean, I don't really think anyway it's about news management. I think that there was this scandal that was unfolding, and it's true that when we first began publishing articles about it in October, November last year, it wasn't clear to anybody what the scale of it was. But I think even 6 weeks ago, we printed in The Guardian the possibility that there could be up to 50,000 people. Anyway, so it's not really a question of news management. It's just a question of why people didn't think it was something that needed to be addressed. I think
why didn't it matter more?
Question.
Why didn't it matter more?
Why didn't these people matter more?
Yes. And what can you tell us finally, Amelia, about the warnings that the Home Office had received prior to the stories you've been reporting? The predictions that this would occur as a direct consequence of both that act in 2014 and the more abstract notion of a hostile environment?
There's an enormously long list of different bits of impact assessment documents, which are the government-ordered internal documents that warn of possible risks, and also reports from charities. There's a really interesting report by somebody called Fiona Borden called Chasing Status that highlighted exactly this issue in 2014, and the Home Office responded to that as well. The Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, with Liberty, has done a whole dossier that's been published this week that describes step by step exactly every warning that the government had, and the list is really long.
Amelia Gentleman, many thanks indeed. The things that we can all agree on, they were responsible for the policy, they were warned what the policy would do. The policy led to elderly British people being incarcerated, persecuted, frog-marched out of their own front door and possibly deported, and no politician is carrying the can for it. Possibly an hour ago you thought I was over-egging the pudding slightly, unless you've been following events very closely. I don't see how you could think that now. This is absolutely unbelievable. But if your key allies, your consiglieres in number 10, former senior programme editors at the BBC and a former political editor of the Daily Mail, you are dedicated. By making those appointments, you have dedicated yourself to manipulating the news, keeping reality away from the plebs and keeping responsibility away from the door of the politicians. It's 2 minutes after 11. And I can't think of any answer to the question we've been asking this morning that doesn't leave the entire country in a very dark shadow, in a very dark place. I sometimes wonder whether I should bring my mum into things. When I say to you, I just imagine how I'd feel if my mum had been threatened with deportation. She doesn't mind. I think she quite likes it. She might not be so happy about this. It's about 18 months ago. It was in winter, and her boiler went. And it was the first time ever that I'd felt my mum was a bit vulnerable. You know, she's into her 70s now, and she is one of the toughest cookies you could ever hope to meet in your life. And she brooks no nonsense from anybody, and she can fight her corner with the greatest of ease. But she was profoundly upset and frustrated by the failure of her providers to sort her boiler out when it was freezing cold. And I mean, I love the bones of my mum, just like most people listening to this love the bones of theirs. And there was something almost visceral in my anger at what was being done to her. That was about a delay in fixing her boiler. Imagine your mum now, or your grandma, or your granddad, or your father. Imagine that they'd been born here in 1964. The recipient of the letter I'm about to read to you arrived here in 1964, aged 6. He's had a national insurance number for all of his working life. He has NHS documentation dating back to 1964. And this is the full text, and I make no apology for reading it in its entirety. This is the full text of the first page of a letter that fell through his letterbox recently. the headline under the Home Office heading is Notice of Immigration Decision, Notice of Removal. Theresa May wrote the act, or introduced the act that made this happen. Amber Rudd has spent 6 months being told that this was happening. Just think of your mum, all right? You are a person with no leave to enter or remain in the United Kingdom. You have not given any reasons as to why you should be granted leave to remain or why you should not require leave to remain. Therefore, you are liable for removal. First paragraph of a letter sent by your government to a British man who has lived here since the age of 6 in 1964. Reasons for decision. The following reasons are given. You are specifically considered a person who has been unable to show evidence of lawful entry because you cannot produce the passport on which you claim to have entered the UK. He was 6. This document has been sent by a department that presided over the destruction of the landing cards that could have contained this man's details. The next heading is liability for removal. Persons who require but no longer have leave to enter or remain are liable to removal from the United Kingdom under Section 10 of the Immigration and Asylum Act 1999 as amended by the Immigration Act 2014. An act introduced when the current Prime Minister was Home Secretary, cited in a letter from her former department, mentioning an act that she introduced. If you do not leave, just think of your mum. Just think of this dropping through her letterbox. If you do not leave the United Kingdom as required, you will be liable to enforced removal to Jamaica. We may remove you via a transit point in an EU member state. 1964. Aged 6. Innocent of any crime. You may be detained or placed on reporting conditions. If you wish to seek legal advice, you must do so now. The next section says, tick 1 box. You will not be removed for the first 7 calendar days after you receive this notice. Think of your mum. Go on. Following the end of this 7-day period and for up to 3 months from the date of this notice, you may be removed without further notice. That's every knock on the door. Every vehicle pulling up outside. You will not be removed, and then that's the box they've ticked. There are 2 other choices. That's what they've been told. You've got 7 days. After that, you may be removed without further notice. Innocent British pensioners frog-marched out of their own front door, terrified and innocent, driven to airports and detention centres under threat of immediate removal. And this government did it. They did it consciously, they did it deliberately, and they did it while boasting about creating a hostile environment. I don't know why some of the journalists I respect are calling for Nick Cohen, for example, who I think is one of the best. He's responded to the publication of this letter. It's been sent to a constituent of David Lammy's by saying that Amber Rudd has to go. Surely Amber Rudd has to resign. I don't know. To me, it seems that Theresa May is wholly responsible for introducing these circumstances. I could be wrong. I may be reading the runes wrong on that. But how can anybody believe that this scandal should unfold and unravel without consequence, without punishment, without resignation? We have, by some measurable distance, the worst government this country has ever seen in place at the moment. It is almost beyond belief, the combination of corruption, dishonesty and incompetence that conspire to create a country in which elderly, innocent British people can be terrorised by their own government with no consequence. And how do you ensure that people who should be shouting about this from the rooftops aren't? Easy. Hire a senior BBC editor and the former political editor of the Daily Mail to do your communications, to be your official spokesman, to call in a few favours, to manage the news, to keep it away from the front pages and the headlines, to leave it languishing in the lefty utopia that is The Guardian. My phone lines are still open for another interpretation, because I don't think I've ever wanted one so much. Phil's in Donegal in Ireland. Phil, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. I just said to the guy that took the call, I said that my late father arrived in England at the same time as the Windrush generations. He was from Ireland, and he saw signs like no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And that's been sort of handed down to me. And as I said to the chap that took the call for me, although Theresa May is clearly the author of this viciousness, and you've got that in the letter, and it's redolent of a totalitarian regime, notice of removal, right? Is that although this is a new piece of legislation that you've clearly been able to follow back through, is that this isn't something new and nasty. This is something very old and nasty.
But not government policy, Phil. I appreciate that the moods you describe and the prejudices you describe, but I've never known it to actually be done to citizens by politicians.
No, this is, if you will, if you allow me to sort of editorialise about it, this is EDL-approved legislation. This is, and I think it's worth noting that this scandal has broken on the 50th anniversary of the Rivers of Blood speech
and the 25th anniversary of Stephen Lawrence's murder.
Indeed, this is the racist send them back reflex, and send them back to a country that, in a sense, isn't theirs. They're being sent back from a country that's theirs, and as you know, and I know, people. This generation of folk were they are patriotically British. They believed, and why shouldn't they, that Britain was their country.
Except talking to Gilbert, talking to Gilbert, one thing fell into place. It's easy for me to sit here and say that they believed this was their country. Talking to Gilbert and to a couple of people yesterday at the Stephen Lawrence Memorial Service, there's an absence of complete shock. I'm completely shocked. But some people of a West Indian background are less shocked because they feel that it does speak to the older truths, the ancient hatreds that you've just described, the notion of being a second-class citizen kind of ingrained into our society in a way that makes people like Theresa May not even realise, as they sit in church and sing their hymns, that they do look upon their neighbours as somehow inferior, as somehow less than them. And I can't, for the life of me, come up with an explanation of what's happening that fits the facts better than that.
Well, which is why I listen to your show all the time. Why I was moved as a journalist in the northwest, in the west of Ireland, to phone in and say, in a sense, there's nothing new about this, and I'm not surprised. Shock implies surprise. I'm sure. I get that.
Those attitudes. Maybe I'm a bit naive. Maybe I've lived in a bit of a bubble, and just kind of. I remember those signs. I remember some of the letters my late father used to get from readers of the Daily Telegraph for the crime of having an apostrophe in his surname. I don't know. Maybe I just thought that things had got better, and older, wiser heads of mine would know that they never really get better. They just go away for a while. Phil, thank you. I'm a little late for the break. It's the only reason I'm cracking on. Is there another explanation for what is happening? Is there? And now that you've imagined your mum getting that letter through her letterbox, you could just about console yourself by saying, yeah, but my mum wasn't born in Jamaica. Forget about those details. Focus instead upon the contempt in which that innocent, elderly British person is held by the British government. And now tell me why no one's resigning. 0345 6060 973. I think it could have happened, and how do you account for the fact that there are currently no governmental resignations from a government that has deliberately, consciously and knowingly persecuted, terrorised and incarcerated entirely innocent old age pensioners? I can't quite believe these words are coming out of my mouth. Bertram is in Milton Keynes. Bertram, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, mate.
All right. First of all, it really is very shameful what has occurred to the Windrush generation, and obviously it will include people from other lands as well.
Yes.
Definitely. This thing is really big. Anyways, back to the point.
You mentioned that, just sorry to interrupt, there's a 74-year-old World War II veteran, Polish-born Spitfire pilot in Birmingham, I read last night, who's being threatened with deportation as well. So I don't suspect, as you suggest, quite rightly, that this will be confined to the so-called Windrush children.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I mean, we look at all of the countries that fell under the flag of the British Empire. So we're looking at all of those sorts of people. Myself included. Anyway, we look at the language that has been employed here. We look at detainment, deportation, internment, documentation, incarceration, and this feeds into the Brexit immigration sort of debates that took place, which also informed policy.
Yes, well, the clamour that something must be done about this problem, and then anybody with a brain in their head would point out, well, the problem is being misrepresented and wholly fraudulently described to you by the usual people, by people like Tony Gallagher, the editor of The Sun, by the Daily Mail, but the government has to do something about this problem. The problem's nowhere near as big as the newspapers say it is, and that's how you end up bringing what did they say about Oscar Wilde? Breaking a butterfly on a wheel, bringing a sledgehammer to crack a nut. That's what we've got here.
Yeah, but James, it goes further than that, because you look at the British values, of decency, fair play, integrity, honesty, responsibility, and accountability. This is what has made Britain strong in the eyes of the world. It has a proud history in lots of instances. But when it comes to race and immigration, it all seems to fall apart, James. And then we find that there's a closing of the ranks, batten down the hatches, protect the leader at all costs, whether it is immoral or not. That is not the point. Refer to a list of all possible errors and omissions and blame it upon bureaucracy and the policy.
It's successive governments. It's a mindset. It's an attitude that's caused this to happen, and it's an attitude that Theresa May definitely has and Amber Rudd possibly has. That's what's caused this, pure and simple.
James, there's an ideology that runs through the...
I don't know. Ideology is too strong a word. It's just an attitude. They don't even know it's there.
Well, it does feed into what's been happening anyway, this attitude.
Yes, of course. Well, the lid has been lifted off people who do have ideologies that are vile and racist, the kind of Enoch Powell admirers. But the rest of us, possibly, and I'm probably guilty of this and I haven't worked it out yet, the rest of us do have innate... well, not innate, but things that have been put inside us as a result of nurturing and conditioning and the way that we look at other people and feeling that others are somehow less than us. So why no resignations, Bertram? How can we be living in a country that can lock up innocent old age pensioners as a direct result of government policy and no government politicians resign?
Well, one may accept responsibility, yes, but one will not...
They kind of did that, didn't they? They've kind of...
That's the difference, James. Responsibility and accountability. Yes, I'm responsible for what has happened, overseeing the debacle at the Home Office. But guess what? Accountability lies elsewhere, and not with me, the Minister of, the Home Secretary.
Not with the current Home Secretary, not with the last Home Secretary, but it's all being done by the Home Office as a direct result of the 2014 Immigration Act, framed by Theresa May and described deliberately, consciously, and of course, we realise now, quite despicably, as a hostile environment. 25 minutes after 11 is the time. Roger is in Dagenham. Roger, what would you like to say?
Well, I'm a son of two Windrush parents. They came over in mid-50s, 56, I think it was. And I promised myself, James, I wouldn't get upset by this. I'm aware of this going on. A lot of us are aware of this for the last few years. Various people, I know an individual went back to Jamaica, couldn't get back on the plane to come back because his papers were incorrect or whatever. And many of us know about it. So we're all sort of saying, oh, at last it's come out. But what's really, really made me angry is the fact that this is Theresa May at the top. This is her policy. And to prove the point, the delegation that wanted to meet with her from the Commonwealth were refused. They wanted to talk to her about this.
12 days ago.
To talk to her.
Yeah, and they were refused, point blank. The only reason this is out there is because of the media storm. Thank God we've got a free press.
Well, you say that. We've got what has happened is one journalist on one newspaper has painstakingly collected growing evidence of these stories to a point where finally it couldn't be ignored by the rest of us. But I hang my head in shame for not being on top of this sooner, and I'd like to think that I'm on the same side as the journalist that's done it.
No, James, look, I've dealt with people in the past, or I've spoken to people, and they've said, they've got immigration problems, whatever. And the first thing that comes into most people's minds is, well, you've been here all this time and you haven't got papers to prove. You can't believe the system would be that cruel to do this. But it is. It's been driven. And the one thing I wanted to say to you this morning, because you hit the nail right on the head when you said about her being protected. A lady called Baroness Scotland was on the TV. I think she's the lead spokesperson for the Commonwealth. She was appointed by Tony Blair or whatever. She came from that era.
Yeah.
Black woman. She was asked by Sky News. You can look this up. She came to this country in '62, and she was 6, I think, or a young girl.
Right, go on.
And I asked her how she felt about this whole thing, expecting her to have some anger, sympathy, and her response was incredibly sad, because she said, "Oh no, we trust Theresa May. We've come together. This just shows you what we can achieve when we all sit down and talk." Now, the Sky News presenter should have come back and said, "But Theresa May didn't want to talk to you. This isn't because you've come asking the question. This has happened because there's a media storm."
She's the Commonwealth Secretary General, isn't she, Baroness Scotland?
That's right. That's right. If you can look at it, I tell you, if you want to. My poor wife has had to put me screaming at the TV because that interview and the lack of.
Well, I didn't see it, so I can't talk about it too much. But
it might be recorded somewhere.
Well, I'll dig it out. But we've got plenty to concern ourselves with. What's your answer to the question of culpability, though? Why would no politician resign after a government policy has persecuted entirely innocent British citizens?
If you look into it. It's been driven. It came from Theresa May. They want this to go away, and I'm really pleased that you won't let it. And I'm really pleased that you read that letter out, because
I can't believe my eyes when I read stuff like that. And also I can't quite believe, and I know it's true, so I do believe it, but I still can't quite believe it, if you'll allow me that moment of dissonance, that people like you have been learning of incidents like this and just sort of, forgive me, but sort of chalking it up as business as usual. Well, of course no one's going to care about my mate who can't come home from Jamaica. People have missed their daughters' weddings. People have been unable to attend the bedsides of dying relatives. And people like you, Roger, you have heard these stories and you thought, well, yeah, of course no one's going to care about that, because...
But you've had MPs, you've had legal people banging on about this, and it's got nowhere. And after a while, what that does, you resign yourself to the fact that, you keep your head down, or you do the best you can to stay out of it. And yes, it's racism, but nobody's going to say it. Why say it? You say the word racism as a black person, you better back that up. It's as toxic as it should be. But this is exactly what it is. It's racism. You won't see this happening to an Australian or somebody else from the Commonwealth that's white.
You may, but the reaction would probably be different. I wonder also whether I suspect that with regard to this government's attitude to disabled people, I suspect a lot of disabled people are listening to this and thinking, well, they did this to us. They treated us as being subhuman. They treated us as... They made my aunt with multiple sclerosis. They asked her whether it was curable. They've sat me down in front of some employee of some ludicrous private sector company that's had the contract awarded to them, and they've asked me. They've told me that I'm losing my benefits because I can walk 6 paces.
But James, it's so bad. People don't believe it.
Yeah. Well, because it doesn't affect them.
Yes, you have to be disabled or you have to be black on the end of this to actually understand just how bad it is. But
for now, and then tomorrow, it will, it will be people. It will go beyond black people and disabled people. It'll be another constituency of people. It will be another section of society that is treated as somehow less than the rest. It's 11:31. I'd quite like to talk to someone who doesn't think anyone should resign, but I can't imagine that if you really have arrived at that conclusion, I worry you might struggle to operate a telephone. It is unbelievable, isn't it, that you could live in a country where a government could persecute, terrorise and incarcerate entirely innocent people, and no one responsible for that policy resigns from that government. It is actually beyond belief. We're not all going mad. There is a naked emperor over there. It's just the emperor is surrounded by paid propagandists. Many of whom used to actually work for the propaganda sheets that have polluted our country and done more damage to our unity and infrastructure than anything since the Luftwaffe. I'm looking at you, Daily Mail. 11:36 is the time. Afra is in Wembley. I've talked too much because I'm so cross and sad, so I'm just going to take loads of calls for the next half an hour and then we'll move on to something else at 12 noon. Afra, you can kick things off. What would you like to say?
Yeah, hi James. My heart is beating so fast at the moment because it's such an emotive subject and because it really nicks into, my whole family and my own personal, history. But first thing I want to say is that no, I don't think that as per usual somebody should resign. Or the sequence of people resign, because then it gets brushed under the carpet. And in actual fact, it's not just the fault of one or two people. This goes back very deeply into the very roots of the whole society. It's not even just the British society. I don't want to, I'm mindful of time, but I'd like to just keep this real and go all the way back to the fact that if you had to subjugate a set of people in order to enslave them and to justify the enslavement of them to work for nothing, that doesn't just simply go away. That for hundreds of years, subjugated as subhuman in order to have a free workforce doesn't just disappear. The colonisation afterwards, the pride of, now we're British, we're no longer slaves. I mean, my parents didn't even tell us that we were once enslaved people, and I'm thankful they didn't, because that could affect your, psychology. Yeah. But to then have that pride, you're free, you're British, and a lot of these people didn't even know they were slaves because our parents, sort of middle-class Caribbean parents, didn't tell their children about this so that mentally you could have some kind of mental freedom. Yeah. You then get invited to the mother country, the country that you learn about day in, day out at school. My sisters who grew up in the Caribbean in their formative years knew more about England than we were ever taught at school. Finally come into England as British citizens, remembering that their parents and their parents before them paid tax into a country, that's to the Queen, that they didn't even live in, whilst the Caribbean islands were being neglected financially. So there was lack of opportunity, not because they are subhuman or incapable, but because the people who run that country had a priority called England. They then come over to help to build up England with pride and integrity. My father wouldn't even allow us to have free school meals because he always said, "You are Fimi Pikini." That means that we are his and nobody else should be responsible for them. That's the integrity of the calibre of people that came over. And I won't use the term Windrush people. They are our nans and our grands and our parents and our elder brothers and sisters. And these are the people, just like throughout history, who have been subjugated to this unfair law. Why? Because you can. Because we've been educated, society has been educated to scapegoat black people throughout. And if that wasn't the case, there wouldn't be such a thing as institutionalised racism, and that's what this is. And that's why I don't think the resignation of one or two people is sufficient, because
no, but it's. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to argue with you about that. But it's better than nothing, and what you're going to get is nothing.
Well, I suspect that when, like we've seen in the past, people resign, it gets forgotten about.
Well, they don't anymore, actually. I mean, I recognise what you're saying. A resignation sort of draws a line under it, whereas this needs to be kept alive and it needs to be kept aflame. But actually, they don't resign anymore. Not since, well, I don't know where you're going to date it to, but the last government minister to resign over a failure in his department, I think, was Lord Carrington resigning as Defence Secretary when the Argentinians invaded the Falklands.
Well, you know, I'm not saying I couldn't be persuaded on that point with regards to resignations. What I am mindful of is, for example, Mark Duggan. You know, there was no gun. You know, he...
Whoa.
Listen.
No, I won't. Well, I will listen. Of course I will, because it would be rude not to. But I don't know I don't know that we need to broaden this out in that direction today.
Yesterday, we had a conversation, which I was listening to, about, is the police institutionally racist? You know, the chief of the Met Police put his hand up in 2015 and said, yes, we are, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, it wasn't on this show, I don't think, because that's a rhetorical question as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but I mean, it was in the... It was in the press.
Well, the Bishop of York, John Santamo, described police forces as still being racist. I mean, he's obviously right, but there'll be plenty of old white men who think he's wrong, and unfortunately they run the media. That's the only reason. That's the only reason stories like that even get debated.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the fact is that institutional racism does exist, and I believe that the roots go all the way back to the subjugation of a particular set of people, which is very hard to erase after.
And that's why people on the other side of the colour divide possibly don't even realise that it's happened to them, because I think Theresa May, who deserves the description you've just applied, and Amber Rudd, who may or may not, we don't know yet, will be deeply, deeply hurt to realise what they are and how they look at people like you, because they have never challenged it, they have never questioned it, but they could not have brought in, Theresa May could not have brought in this policy if she felt that it could affect people like her mum. So she thinks that your mum is not like her mum. And what is the difference? It's not just about countries of birth. Boris Johnson was born in blinking America. It's about colour, or class, and probably both.
That's right. But can you imagine what our children go through at school also? Because, you know, what we're seeing is this manifestation with our parents and our grandparents. It happens in schools. You know...
But, you know, this is me now being a little bit patronising probably, but, you know, David Lammy is in the House of Commons, Diane Abbott is in the House of Commons, Sadiq Khan is the Mayor of London. The world is better than it was when your grandmas and your mothers and your fathers and your brothers and your cousins and your uncles and your aunts arrived. The country is more welcoming. It is better. We're going backwards at the moment, largely because of the monsters we unleashed during the Brexit campaign. But I would tell my children that the battle is not over. But the movement has been, in the last 50 years, since the Windrush arrived, the movement has been in the right direction.
Yeah, sometimes you have to go back to go forward. That's life, and sometimes you feel as though, you know, you are slipping, you know, terribly backwards.
Well, we are at the moment. We are at the moment, and this policy, this hostile environment, is 10 steps backwards, and it was done deliberately by Theresa May, which is why I remain confused at her the failure of any politicians to take responsibility for this. I really do. You had a lot to get off your chest, Afra.
I have, yeah. If we can keep hold of this and not let it go before we've got some real traction in terms of...
Well, the result has been secured in the context of the people who are being affected. Amber Rudd will be held to account. I've got to know David Lammy a bit in the last few months, and there's no way he is going to let this go. But the question then returns to, are we just, as you suggest, brushing it under the carpet until these ancient hatreds reveal their ugly heads once again at some point subsequently, or until the target moves on to another minority, another section of our country that can be othered by evil propagandists, and that is the challenge that we all face. It really is. I'll do my bit for as long as I can. do begin to wonder, though, quite how some people in this line of work sleep at night. And the answer is they're the same. They look at Afra and her mum, and they don't see their own mum. Why not? It's 11:45. It's a strange one, isn't it? The absolute absence of political accountability. It is quite unlike anything I've ever known. I can't imagine a government-created scandal. That's the thing about this. This is a consequence of a policy that was written by Theresa May, and it has led to innocent people being locked up, terrorised and persecuted, and no one is resigning. I keep coming back to it and thinking, come on, mate, everyone else has moved on. They're all talking about the royal baby. Why can't you? And because you can't lock up innocent people. You can't enact policies that lock up and deport innocent people and then just waltz off into the next meeting, the next, I don't know, problem, the next raft of nonsense about Brexit. Beverly's in Bromley. Beverly, what would you like to say?
Hi. Well, first of all, I'd like to join the many other people who have thanked you for ensuring that this fire doesn't die a death. My brother, who grew up here from the age of 11, he came over from Jamaica, went to school here, did an apprenticeship here with Volkswagen, etc., was refused a visa to come back from Jamaica to attend Mum's funeral. Yeah, absolutely. And she was heartbroken. She wanted to see her eldest son, and that didn't happen. And my take on why we're not seeing heads rolling is that actually it's the establishment that will drive this. It's the establishment who will decide that, no, you've gone too far. And who is the establishment? Totally male, white, upper middle class.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that. But I'm white, and I'm not upper middle class, but I'm working on it, and I'm certainly not going to be responsible for letting these people off the hooks. I think you're being a little bit simplistic, but I don't know what we mean when we say the word establishment anymore, because under a different government there would have been resignations. At a different point in history there would have been. No one is putting their arms around Theresa May and Amber Rudd and protecting them, except members of their own party and the former journalists that they've hired to perpetrate their propaganda.
It might be simplistic, but often the answers are very simple.
Yes, this is true.
So who is driving this?
No, it's not. It's the media. It purely and simply is the media. If everybody joined forces and demanded standards are applied equally to everybody, then one of them would have to resign. Just imagine if it was a Labour government that had presided over this.
Who is they? If they decided, and that's what I'm saying. If you look at the media, it's woefully unrepresentative. Who is it that we have on LBC? And again, this is a point that's been raised on many occasions, who will talk about this, not just from the perspective of, I'm passionate about this as you are, but who can talk about this experientially. My daughter had an interview at Cambridge recently,
yes,
and was told that because she got 1 B amongst all of the other A's and A stars that she had, that unfortunately, laws are oversubscribed this time. If people really want to make a change, they have to kind of walk that, not just talk it. And I believe it is the establishment. Somebody will make a decision, or somebody will step down because of an allegation of paedophilia or something else. They have to go. But when you put it was so poignant this morning, which is why I felt compelled to call. If this was a group of white, older people, the whole country would be absolutely in uproar.
I think you're right.
People are seen as second-class citizens. There is no doubt whatsoever about that. We came to Britain because my uncle served in the RAF in the 40s. My parents came here in the 50s. And if there is one thing that can be said to be good out of all of this, is the fact that people are beginning to wake up to the fact that black people have been here since the 40s and since the 50s. They aren't recent arrivals. They actually contributed to the making and the shaping of modern Britain, something that has often been overlooked.
I think you're right, and I think that I suppose that's a silver lining of sorts, that this does provide us all with lessons on what the contribution has been, if for the people that needed those lessons. And apart from the usual sort of full-on illiterate racists who pepper the LBC Facebook feed like so much manure, I haven't actually come across anybody who feels anything other than shame at what's happened over this. Shame and anger. The problem is, and this is why I think I would talk more about the media than I would about the establishment. The problem is that the shame and anger needs to be stoked, and they stoke it on all the wrong things. It's all, I think, students are next. Students who have a protest are the next recipient of anger and fury, not the government. And Brexit is part of this now, because I do think that even some of the more toxic titles, like The Sun and the Mail, would be going after Theresa May on this if it wasn't for Brexit, because they kind of are so desperate to keep her there and preside over the unravelling, as it were, that they won't run the risk of Jeremy Corbyn getting in, or somebody who might actually slam the brakes on.
I'm not absolutely convinced on that.
No, I'm not either. I'm just putting it out there. I think it's true, but not. No, I wouldn't swear it.
I think that certainly that there's a part of that. We do need to have stability in the country, etc., etc. However, this is such a huge issue that I believe that if the we who made the decisions that this is a newsworthy story and that it will go across, as you said, it will spread and grow, but if the we that make these decisions don't really fully understand how appalling this is.
Yeah, that's the thing. And that's why I do try and find these buttons of empathy by talking about my own mum and asking people to imagine their mum. And it doesn't matter what colour you are, we all, well, almost all of us will feel something towards our own mums, our own mothers, and the tone of these letters and the message that they deliver and the experiences of these elderly, innocent British people. Well, they shame us all. And unlike a couple of my callers, I do think resignations would help, although I grant you that they shouldn't be allowed to draw a line under the scandal. It's actually incredible. 2 hours, I feel we've barely drawn breath. Phone line, we could continue. We'll change the subject at 12 so that I can return to this in subsequent days. But I think sometimes we find the phrase, don't we? The idea that a government can take a decision deliberately with warnings and predictions that leads to the persecution of innocent elderly civilians, and nobody in that government resigns. They should all resign. Abdul's in Croxley Green. Abdul, what would you like to say?
Good morning. You just made me laugh there when you said they should all resign.
I made myself laugh as well, but it's unprofessional.
I totally agree with you. This is my third attempt to try and get on your show. So,
third time lucky, mate. Don't blow it. You've only got 2 minutes.
I know I have. I think institutionalised racism is rife, not just in the government. I think it's in the workplace, in the police, in the Foreign Office. It goes on and on. We have been classified as subhuman. So the way that we are being treated is nothing new. When my parents came here in '63, they were met with no dogs, no Irish, no blacks. That racism is still rife in this country today. And when you look at what Theresa May has done, not only did she turn around and say to the heads of the Commonwealth, I can't meet with you today, that just goes to show the arrogance of this woman who thought that I've done something, I've become Prime Minister, it's going to go away. Amber Rudd should resign. You should, and then you've got people in the Home Office and the Foreign Office. They must have known what is going on. So therefore, you've got people in there that should also resign, but they won't because they think they're whiter than white. It's only affecting black people.
They won't, because pressure hasn't been brought to bear, and I don't know how big a role Brexit plays in this. I know in the context of the Sun and the Mail, who are the biggest cheerleaders, they're just terrified of anything shaking the incredibly flimsy situation in cabinet at the moment, and I don't know. I can't prove anything. You can't live an alternative universe. But no pressure is being brought to bear, and the tiny amount that is calling for Amber Rudd's resignation rather than Theresa May's, which doesn't actually make sense to me. Theresa May wrote the flipping act. She introduced it.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. And you're right. Papers like the Mail, which is such a racist paper. The Sun, well, I wouldn't even use that to wipe something with. But, you know, it's so good that a paper like The Guardian, which, you know, I've read for years and is always up front, and like you said, a journalist there has been bringing this up for 24 weeks, and no one knew. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. Unless we've got a Stevie Wonder working at the Foreign Office. Seriously.
Even then, they you know, could have got the audio version. It's coming up to 12 noon. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.